The heat came on like a held breath, thick and patient, pressing down on the Whitford place until even the cicadas grew hoarse. It was July of 1848, and the bluffs above the river steamed beneath a lid of low sky, from the cotton rows to the pecan trees gone still in their own stifled shade. The land smelled of damp earth, turned meat, and magnolia sweetness going to rot. Smoke from the brick ovens crawled along the ground and clung to ankles. Dogs lay in the sugar sand with their tongues lolling, too tired to rise when someone passed. They had learned that the day was not meant for barking. In the kitchen yard behind the big house, with the Natchez Trace crouching like a shadowed memory beyond the pines and St. Catherine Creek whispering somewhere below the cane, Elias Carter kept his head down and his hands moving. He was 14 by most reckonings, small-boned, not yet tall enough to look a hired white boy in the eye, but he had a stillness in him that made adults uneasy. You could feel it, the way a person can feel a storm in the gums and the joints. He cut biscuits from a rolled sheet with the rim of a tin cup, set them neat on a pan, slid them into the oven's mouth where coals lay red as old wounds. He watched the color come, counted heartbeats, 1, 2, 3, to keep the timing right, and in counting, did not think of the lake of air inside his chest that had been quiet all morning, so it would not betray him. "Elias," said Hester May, the cook, her voice a low rasp polished by years of smoke. "Butter churn. Up and down, not side to side. If you rattle it, you break it." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and placed the churn between his knees. His palm blister had burst earlier, but he found the exact rhythm Hester wanted, the patient stroke that coaxed the cream toward solidity. Hester, in her 40s and built square as a hearth, kept one eye on him and the other on the two field girls scouring copper pots with ash. The kitchen was a separate house, like all kitchens on plantations, fearful of fire, brick walls sweating, slate roof glimmering dull under the white glare. Within, it spoke its own language, the clank of iron, the slap of wet rags, the mutter of oil, the crackle of fat. The air wore onion and pork as if they were garments. There was a wedding today, which meant bodies and work and judgment. "Don't scorch those pecans, Purdy," Hester called without turning, and Purdy lifted her. "Pan an inch from the coals. Elias, fetch more thyme from the garden when you're done. If I smell anything but thyme, I'll cut your ears off and feed 'em to Mr. Silas's dogs." "Yes, ma'am," Elias said again. He churned with the solemnity of a clerk copying a will. If his hands shook, he made them part of the churn's motion so no one would remark on it. He kept his eyes on the froth breaking along the lid, but in his mind he walked the garden paths in the far corner beyond the smokehouse, where the soil fell away toward the creek and thorny things grew in shade like secrets. Out in the main house, they were draping garlands over the wide gallery and pinning white ribbons to the cypress columns. A fiddler, a barrel-chested man from Port Gibson named Luther Dugan, plucked and tuned, and his notes drifted on the humidity like gnats. The bride, Clara Bell Thompson, whose father owned a store in Vicksburg that sold ribbons and bolts of calico and high-priced French beads, had arrived with trunks and a Bible presented by her mother's church in Louisville. The groom, Nathaniel Whitford, had spent the morning on a horse riding the fence line as if he must be seen doing something manly on his wedding day. And the overseer, Mr. Silas Breedlove, walked like a whip made into a man, shoulders forward, eyes tasting the room, counting mistakes before they were made. He had a scar across his cheek, pale as chalk, and his fingers smelled always of spirits, whether drinking or cleaning pistols. Elias had looked at none of them directly, not since first light. He did not need to. He had learned that watching a man like Silas was not as useful as listening when he chose to be silent. And the big house itself did most of the boasting. Its halls breathed money. The floors shone, and in the front parlor hung a painting of Nathaniel's grandfather beside a steamboat on the Mississippi. Smoke poured from its stacks like a sermon. 2 marble mantels had been shipped up from New Orleans at a cost that made even other planters blink. An aunt from Natchez proper had once said the Whitford land had lowest soils blessed by God, and everyone had laughed. Only the enslaved heard the river's voice beneath such words, A quiet eating away at the bank, the sound of hunger with no mouth. The churn resisted and then gave. Hester checked the curds with 2 fingers, nodded and said, "Take that to the cool room, then fetch my thyme and bring in wood. We are not let to shame ourselves today." She turned, her gaze pinning him lightly as a hand on the shoulder. "You hear me, boy? Whatever it is you got simmering in that little head, let it go until midnight. White folks ain't people on days like this, they're theater, and the theater will eat you whole if you look at it sideways." "I'm looking at the butter," Elias said, keeping his voice ordinary. He took the stoneware to the cool cellar where shelves sweated and jars fogged like breath. He stood alone for a heartbeat more than necessary and let the dimness pass over him. The room hummed like a throat preparing to sing. He set down the butter, turned, and crossed out into the light, across the packed earth where chicken feathers drifted like ash. Near the smokehouse, he paused to drink from the pump. The handle squealed. Water bulged silver and then ran, tasting of iron and algae and the memory of turtles. From here he could see the kitchen garden, fenced with split rails and twine. Hester's thyme grew there, yes, and basil, and sage gone leggy with the heat. Tomato vines slouched in their frames, their fruit heavy and split with sugar. But the garden's far edge fell into a tangle, night flowers and bristled weeds and volunteer things the wind had carried. Beyond that, the downward slope led to the creek where water stood in dark pockets under cypress knees. It was here, at the seam where ordered rows collapsed into the old green, that Elias's grandmother had spoken to him years ago, when her hands were still gentle and she still had all her teeth. He could hear her now, though she had been sold south into the invisible once the last cotton good year came and the debts needed to be soothed. Not the white berries, child. Not the ones that look like tears. The other kind with a bitter smell when bruised. Don't touch the water roots unless you are ready to be a widow as soon as you are a bride. Seeds make a mouth forget its own name. Leaves make a heart run and then sit down hard. Elias knelt in the thyme and pinched sprigs because Hester would count the sprigs. He gathered them into his work cloth, counted slower, and moved outward into the scruff. The air grew cooler by a finger's width. Flies blessed his neck and then lifted. He knew where things lived because he had spent years hiding from work, when work meant a man's fists. The Jimson weed, the old women called it thornapple, threw up white trumpets that smelled like dreams when the sun lost its edge. The seed pods were prickled and hard as little maces. He rolled one in his palm and felt his skin crawl with the memory of a dog foaming and stumbling until it collapsed, eyes staring at a thing only it could see. He cut 3 pods with his pocket blade quickly and dropped them in his cloth beneath the thyme where their rattle went silent. A little deeper in the shade, the creek unrolled like a strip of tarnished metal. Water hemlock clustered there, its umbrella flowers delicate as lace. He did not touch the roots. His grandmother had pressed his wrist hard enough to bruise when he reached for them years ago. "That one barks in your blood, boy," she had said, voice a hush. "A mean barking and then you go stiff. It doesn't distinguish the guilty from the born." He left it be. Farther along, castor beans towered like a child's bad drawing of trees, leaves broad and veined, seed pods marbled. He had watched Silas's favorite hunting hound sicken after chewing a pod that had fallen into the yard. Hester had muttered ricinous like a run of beads, spat, and burned the plant closest to the fence. The ones by the creek remained. Nobody cared what grew in a place that could drown you ankle deep. He gathered 3 pods and a leaf, careful not to tear the skin and draw the plant's oil onto his fingers. He wrapped these in the cloth as well, with thyme atop it all. Last, just because the poor will use any nail if the coffin is to hold, he clipped a stem of foxglove from where it shouldn't have been, somebody's ornamental purple mouths nodding where they had crept from the parlor garden. He wasn't sure of foxglove. He only knew it had a justice for hearts that beat too proud. He took 1 stem, no more. The cloth was heavier now, and he knotted it with emotion so it looked accidental. By the time he returned, Hester was slapping dough again, and Purdy was crying because she had indeed scorched the pecans. Hester cuffed her kindly and sent her for more. Elias laid the thyme on the table as expected and tucked the bald cloth into the deep pocket of his trousers. His shirt clung to him, salt stiff on the spine. He went for wood and fed the ovens until the bricks glowed. When he bent to lift a split log, his scabbed palm screamed, and he shut it down. Pain had a place today. That place was not in front of people. The day gathered itself like a heron readying to lift and hung there, held. Voices multiplied. Carriages arrived, wheels sounding like bones in a bag. You could smell perfume in a place where the usual smell was iron and men. Elias looked once, quick as a squirrel, silk dresses bright as poison berries, parasols swiveling, laughter flitting, a boy in a miniature suit tripping on a step and crying until a hand hushed him, as if even children must not make a noise that did not flatter. "The house, Elias," Silas Breedlove's voice. The boy went still, then turned to show only his hands. "Take lemonade to the front. Mind your feet. Don't stare. Don't breathe unless they say so." "Yes, sir," Elias said, eyes on the tray. He moved past the parlor doors, through reflected light. He saw Nathaniel Whitford's profile for the first time in weeks, a chin already fleshing into a man's self-satisfaction, a mouth a little too soft. Beside him, Clara Bell smiled as if everything had been arranged only for that smile. She was pale, prettier than the local girls, hair pinned with real pearls. Elias did not look directly, only enough to know which creature the house would protect if it burned. A preacher from Port Gibson, Reverend Abner Collings, known for sermons that rode the air like thunderheads, laughed high and slapped Nathaniel's shoulder. Judge Horace Langley of Natchez, with a watch chain fat as a little snake, leaned to murmur something about contracts and shipments in a steamboat called Caesar. Elias knew the names because men said them as if they were spells, and because knowing the names of spells can sometimes teach you where to step. He moved. He returned. He moved again. He carried meat to be carved, trays with beignets dusted ghost white, bowls of coleslaw flecked with crimson where Hester had slipped in pickled pepper, and each round, the cloth in his pocket bumped his thigh with the faithfulness of a second heartbeat. By late afternoon, the sky braced for evening. Heat pooled instead of lifting. Someone fired a gun across the back pasture in salute, and crows rose, an ugly bouquet. The fiddler slung out a jig people pretended not to know in order to keep their Sunday faces. Hester sent him to the pantry for salt and to the sideboard for the cloves and to the little locked chest for the bottle labeled laudanum. Not for the guests, never for the guests, but for the bride's fretful nerves. He brought all of it, and silently noted the chest's key left in the lock. He did not touch the laudanum beyond setting it on the table. There are poisons that just sleep with bad manners, and then there are poisons that remember each person who has ever cried in a field. Late in the hour before sunset, when the cloud edges went ragged as lace, Hester ordered him to skim the stew. A black iron pot sat haughty in the corner, steaming a wet ghost. He took the long-handled spoon and drew off the fat. The stew was meant for the servants' table and a few of the drunker guests who, by the end of any evening, could not distinguish between peasant food and heaven's own. He skimmed, and as he skimmed, he thought of how seeds become powder beneath a pestle, and how powder becomes invisible once it finds a wet hand to hold it. He finished the skimming. He set the spoon down. He turned to the shelf where Hester kept the mortar and pestle made from some old bonewood that smelled faintly of licorice. He took it because Hester had told him to grind peppercorns for the gumbo, which he did, pounding steadily until a dark perfume lifted like a benediction. And while his arm moved, his mind didn't have to. When the pepper was done, he tipped it into a tin and head bent as if considering whether that was enough. He untied the knot in his pocket. He worked without drama. The cloth opened under the table. He shelled the Jimson seeds into his palm, a little river of black-brown ovals. Not all. Never all. Enough for dreams. Enough for forgetting one's own name. He crushed them in the mortar after the pepper had been removed, then wiped the pestle with a rag until no fragrance remained but wood. He did not crush the castor beans, he knew better. He pressed them, split them, scraped the pale grain with the knife, and let what flecks would fall. No more. For the foxglove, he pinched 2 blossoms until they went wet in his fingers and touched, that wet to the inside of the cloth. He put the used cloth back in his pocket, pepper tin where it had been, mortar on its peg. Hester's back was to him, shoulders taut, humming an old tune made up of 3 notes. One for sorrow, one for keeping. Your hands, one for when sorrow and hands were both taken. Purdy cried again, quiet over onions. Mr. Silas told a joke to a planter's son that Elias could tell was about a man and a mule, and everyone laughed too hard. Somewhere a glass broke and nobody cared. The world clarified, as if heat had cooked. Away the vagueness and left only edges. Elias dipped the ladle into the stew. He let it fall back, plop, like a body hitting shallow water. He took a small bowl, scooped liquid, and added a stingy pinch from the mortar, the part that was not pepper and not anything that could be named in a kitchen. He stirred, tasted none of it, and poured it back into the pot as if returning grace. He did not breathe for 3 full beats. Then he did it again to the second pot where the gumbo would go for the servants' table at the far end of the yard. There, where white men, too drunk to finish a thought, might wander and stick their spoons where they did not belong. He did not touch the wine, not yet. The wine would be its own proceeding, its own river, and a river must be judged by the flow and not the banks. By the time the first hornets tested the sugar crusts on the pies and the fiddler's elbow had begun to shine, the ovens were emptied and the long tables were set. Tin plates for some, porcelain for others. There were loop-handled cups and crystal goblets that made a sound like cold when you touched them. Reverend Collings blessed the meal with a prayer that mistook gratitude for air, and hands clapped like birds startled into flight. Hester nodded once at Elias. He stood behind the service table with the other boys and girls as the white guests filed past, smiling wide, telling themselves what a fine thing decency looks like when it is draped over theft. If Elias looked at Nathaniel Whitford then, at the clean square of his jaw and the little cleft that women like to gossip about, it was only to see the distance between the man's mouth and the ladle he would raise. If he looked at Clara Bell, it was only to see how her gloves creased when she gripped her napkin. He did not think of his mother bleeding in a row while Son ate her. He did not think of the auction block in Natchez under the shade where people bought people like candies and cattle. He held the ladle and did not tremble, and where trembling rose like some animal from a burrow, he placed his heel on its neck and leaned. Someone said, "Where is Mr. Breedlove's special bottle?" And someone else said, "Judge Langley, you must taste the gumbo. Miss Hester has a genius with okra." And someone else said, My, the magnolias are almost too much tonight, aren't they? It smells like a funeral and a wedding both. The sun slid at last toward the tree line and made a golden screen of the Spanish moss. A very little wind woke and crept through the yard, indifferent to the bodies arranged under it. Elias dipped and served. He watched spoons rise like moons and lower as if gravity itself were drunk. His throat had gone so dry he thought of cracking it open with his fingers for water. Hester's elbow brushed his once solid as a post in a flood. He felt the pocketed cloth against his thigh, heavy, damp with the heat, and in that weight lay his whole life arranged like a poor man's chess, each piece simple, each move costly, each square a sermon. He did not look down. He did not look up. He existed at the level of bowls and hands in steam, where the truth of things always hides. When the first scream came from the far side of the porch, as a friend of the bride's pricked her finger on a corsage pin and laughed too loud at her own clumsiness, and then, a beat later, turned frowning as if she had forgotten both laughter and pain, Elias did not move except to serve the next ladleful. He was a shadow made obedient. The scream blurred into laughter again. Not yet. The world can hold its breath longer than any one boy can. And the boy whose breath the world had mistaken for its own did what he had always done. He waited. The Natchez trace lay out there in the trees, older than any house. St. Catherine Creek murmured under its own fallen logs. The river itself, broad and brown as a god that does not care who kneels, rolled past Natchez under the hill toward places where men mouthed new names for old crimes. The sky lowered. The candles would be lit soon, and with them, other fires. He told his hands to be simple. He told his face to be a wall. In his skull, behind his eyes, his grandmother's whisper moved like a snake in leaves. Don't name what you do, child. Let the land name it for you. And the land, ancient and patient, said nothing at all. If you want to see how Elias's plan unfolds in this southern nightmare, subscribe and comment your thoughts before you continue. The song outside was bright and slippery, a jig meant to make knees forget what they had done in fields, and it slithered through the slats of the kitchen like a snake that had learned to whistle. Elias worked in its braided shadow, the tune snagging now and then on the nail heads hammered into the doorframe, the rhythm catching on the soot-browned rafters and fluttering loose again. He kept his eyes on the work. The room held its own weather, grease heat, onion fog, the faint metallic breath of the knives cooling on the table, and in that weather his hands were the only things that knew their season. He washed the mortar, once more with scalding water, and wiped it with a rag that had been boiled free of its former life. He set the bonewood back under the shelf for a heartbeat, then drew it toward himself again as if changing his mind not once but twice. He listened for Hester's footsteps, heavy, rooted, and Purdy's lighter skitter and the low murmur of the two field girls cutting sweet potatoes to ribbons. Beyond that, he listened for Mr. Silas Breedlove's boots, the pace of a man who believes floorboards have been sworn to hold him. When he heard none of those boots, he unknotted his pocket and slid out the second cloth, the one he had hidden within the first, the one he had sewn with a poor boy's needle from the hem of an old shirt. In the cloth lay a scatter of berries, so black they reflected the light like tiny eyes. There are many nightshades in the world. Even the word is a crossroad. This was the hedgerow kind, a solanum the women called devil's grape and children called don't. Berries sweet at first and then bitter with a memory your tongue cannot spit out. He had picked them just past the rail fence where the Whitford rows gave up their geometry, under the reach of a persimmon that had never learned obedience. He had hidden them under the pump stones while the sun climbed, then moved them here at noon, folded within time, so that any nose would think of Sunday, stews. Beside the berries, he placed a little cone of powder wrapped in newspaper torn from a Vicksburg circular. Fowler's for rats. The headline itself was respectable, advertising a patent medicine that promised clean barns and fewer gnawed hulls. But inside the twist, the powder gleamed a chalky, unfriendly white. Arsenic trioxide had many names, most of them lies. Ratbane, inheritance powder, white snow. It lived in the smokehouse cabinet because Mr. Whitford disliked rats the way he disliked debts, loudly and with sudden displays of force. Elias had seen Hester measure out a pinch in winter when the traps were slow, and the meat sacks went light on the hooks, and had watched men laugh as rats died stiff as sticks. No one had counted how many pinches lived in the tin, because no one had imagined a child might weigh out the future grain by grain. He touched neither cloth nor cone with bare fingers longer than a blink. He folded his rag twice, made a glove of it, tipped the berries into the mortar. They rolled like little beads from a broken rosary. He raised the pestle and brought it down. The skins burst with soft, polite sounds as if clapping for their own ruin. Juice spread purple-black, seeding the grain of the bonewood, spattering the lip. He worked them to paste, the pestle rising and falling with the steadiness of a man in a field cutting a furrow that must not wander, not even once, or the whole row will tell on him. Outside, the fiddler found a higher gear and the guests clapped time with soft hands. Someone tried a reel and gave it up after 3 steps because the heat had made even pride slick with fatigue. Laughter pitched high, the kind that is less a sound than a handkerchief waved at the sun. A woman called for hymn fragments to bless the union. The fiddler answered with a low run that sounded like a psalm shouted across a river by men in chains. A boy, white in a tiny vest the color of the river at dusk, ran past the kitchen in pursuit of a dog and stumbled over nothing and screamed as if the earth had tried to eat him. His mother's voice smoothed him like butter. "Hush, hush," she said, and the hush settled on everyone for a breath, as if it had come not from a woman but from the land itself. Elias turned the pestle until the berries were an ink that wanted to write. He held the mortar to his nose and did not breathe. He was not thinking of the taste, he was thinking of a day 3 summers ago when the cotton burned a white hole in the field, and the sun pressed men and women flat as thoughts. He had been 12 and light as a bundle of kindling. His mother had been lighter still then, hung a rope wound twice around her waist and tied tight. That afternoon, Hester had sent her to the smokehouse to fetch bacon scrap for flavoring. She had not come back. Elias had been sent, too, because a boy can be poured into any space, and he had found her outside the rows instead, lying on her side in the weeds at the edge of the cotton where the overseer's shadow could not quite reach. Her hands were covered in dirt the way a child's are covered in sugar when a good thing has fallen into their lap. In her palm lay a baby onion stolen from Hester's patch, the brown skin still furred with soil. Her eyes were open and unfocused, in the way of people looking at something far away and coming fast. Silas Breedlove had stepped out of the light like a story. "She'll be an example," he'd said, and he had used the word example as if it were a hymn. They had left her there until evening. By the time anyone carried her, the magnolia had opened and put its sick perfume on her to claim kin. The memory lay in him like a brick in a well. When he moved, the water around it moved. When he slept, it cooled him and woke him with the clink of a bucket against stone. Her mouth had been open and he had wanted to put his fingers there and give her back her breath, the way you put a carved stopper in a decanter to keep the sweetness from leaving. He had not. He had stood apart the way people stand from lightning. That night, after the first shouts had faded and the dog stopped stirring the dust, his grandmother had taken his wrist and pulled him into the seam behind the smokehouse where the creek's whisper could not be bothered to rise. She had told him the names of plants like she was baptizing them in his head. "These are the ones that will walk with you if you call their secret names, child. But they don't care who they walk for. They walk for the first mouth that speaks to them plain." He scraped the nightshade paste into a small jar that had once held quince jam, wiped the lip, and corked it with a plug he had carved from an old corncob to keep ants out. He washed the mortar again, poured the water into the yard where the dirt drank and told no tales. He dried the bowl with a clean rag and brought the cone of arsenic to the table. He untwisted the newspaper gently and read the stranger's blocky letters because reading the names of poisons is a way of making them take their hats off when they enter. "Fowlers," it said. "Guaranteed." Guaranteed was a word white. Men used the way some men use a pistol, pointed, loud, and meant to move the air. The powder within was finer than ash and glowed with its own absence of color. He tapped out a pinch, not a heap like a cook's pinch, but a scholar's, onto a spoon, then slid it into the jar with the berries. The purple swallowed the white, as easily as night swallowed the last breath of pink after a sunset. He added a second scholar's pinch and then a third, so stunted and exacting it might have been measured by a clerk. He recapped the jar and rolled it in his palm like a coin no one would ever see. Hester's voice came from the oven's mouth. "Boy, is that pepper ready for the gumbo?" "Yes, ma'am," Elias said, and brought the tin and watched her toss it by instinct into the roiling belly of a pot that smelled like marsh and Sunday. He stood so near the heat he could smell his own sweat go sweet and then sour. Hester scrunched her face. "Fetch the decanters. Mr. Whitford wants his father's Madeira opened. Says it's a night for old grapes." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the words sounded like the ones a man says at the rail of a ship when he throws something into the river, knowing the river does not return what is given. The decanters lived in the butler's pantry where cool air pretended to be a different season. Elias took them one by one, their bellies round and their necks proud, and set them on the work table. The glass held whispers of old feasts, sticky bottom notes of molasses and nutmeg, a memory of plums. On the shelf above, 4 bottles crouched, a pair from a Porto bound in straw, a French port that had come upriver with a man who bragged of Paris as if it were a thing he had married, and the Whitford's Madeira, chosen not for its country of birth but for its habit of being praised in front of lessers. Elias selected the Madeira and one of the Oportos because people were sharp about who drank what. If the wrong men died, the wrong questions would be asked. He put the bottles aside for a moment and lifted the jar of nightshade and arsenic to the candle. The paste winked, black as a pupil blown wider than reason. He found the smallest funnel, a tin thing Hester used when she filled the bluing bottles, and wiped it. He set it in the mouth of the first decanter, then hesitated, not out of doubt, but because he had learned the trick of stepping back from himself and watching his own hands as if they belonged to somebody who could still be saved. The trick did not save him. It only made time wider and thinner, like taffy, and let him move within it while other people drowned in its glue. He tipped the jar and let a string of black drop into the empty glass. Not much. He had learned from dogs and from men that big poisons are loud, and loud things bring attention, and attention is a hand on the neck. He swirled the decanter to streak the sides, then held it to the light until the glass looked merely dirty with an old polish. He did the same with the second decanter. He recorked the jar, wiped the funnel so hard the rag came away bruised, tucked both rag and jar back into the pocket of the blue coat Hester let him wear on good days when she wanted the line of servants to look like a lesson. He pulled the corks from the Madeira and the Oporto, their size like old men finding chairs. The smell of wine lifted. Nuts, dried orange peel, the dark happiness of shipholds and sugar and men who never asked who loaded what. He poured into each decanter slowly, letting the liquid catch the paste, carry it, confuse it, convince it, to disappear. He watched the wine take the poison the way a river takes a dead thing, gratefully as if weight were a prayer. He swirled again until the inside of each glass was a single thought. He held both up to the window and the day's last light went through them and confessed nothing. Outside, someone began to sing. A woman's voice pitched to sound pretty even when it carried words that were heavy as iron. The song was about Jacob and Rachel and 7 years in patience dressed in God's Sunday clothes. It drifted over the yard and down the slope and touched St. Catherine Creek, which pursed its wet lips and said nothing back. The fiddler tucked himself under the singing and laid down a bed of sound like the boards of a coffin. People laughed in between the notes at things that had not been jokes a year before. Men slapped one another's shoulders to make their palms remember who they were. A little bell was rung, the sort with a finger loop for a lady to wag, and someone exclaimed, "Bring the bride." Elias set the decanters aside and turned to the stew pot again. Hester had left to fetch more salt because salt was status tonight, the way it always is when people think they have bent the earth to their hunger. The gumbo rolled and hissed like a swamp taught to speak. He took the long spoon and drew off. More fat, watched it stutter across the surface like a promise not meant to be kept. He ladled a shallow pool into a smaller pan and brought it to a simmer at the edge of the coals. He unstoppered the berry jar and dipped the tip of a knife, just a glistening breath of black, and smeared it under the lip of the ladle so the stew would wash it as it passed. He did not add more. He did not need to. He carried the shallow pan to the big pot and trickled it in, circling the rim the way a preacher circles a conclusion he hopes will obey him. He stirred. He wiped the ladle under the lip of his shirt, where the fabric would hold its tongue. He put the jar away and washed his hands until they might have been new. He dried them on a cloth that had no past. He took up the decanters again and ran a clean finger around each mouth and then wiped the finger on the hem of his trousers, where dirt already told a story no one would read. The door opened, and Mr. Silas stepped into the kitchen's heat. The way a man puts his foot in a trap to prove the trap is his. "Wine to the sideboard," he said. "Judge Langley wants to say a few words about the river trade before the toasts." He sneered, a motion as unconscious as breathing. Every man thinks the river cares about his words. His eye slid. Over Elias snagged on the decanters and then let go. "You boy, carry, don't trip. If you trip, I'll hang you on the fence by your belt loops and let the buzzards decide whether you belong to the birds or the hogs." "Yes, sir," Elias said, and the yes was only a shape his mouth made. He took the decanters by their throats and felt the cool of the glass and the slosh within. He followed Silas through the doorway into the wide swelter, where ladies had begun to fan themselves in unison like a flock of pale, well-trained doves. He set the Madeira at the place near the head of the board, where Nathaniel Whitford's goblet waited, and the Oporto halfway down, where men with lesser names would reach without thinking. He stepped back, hands changing into hands that had never held anything heavier than a tray. He returned for the stew. Hester came barging back with her salt and smacked his shoulder lightly as she passed, the way a tree smacks a wind when it remembers that it knows how to stand. "Mind the serving," she said. "Smile with your posture, don't show your teeth. Teeth are for people who are allowed to bite." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and thought of how everything tonight had been arranged to keep mouths busy, with food, with songs, with words about the river and cotton and God. He dipped the ladle and watched the gumbo drape itself back into itself, heavy and slick as a confession told to the wrong ear. He filled a tureen and wiped the rim until it was perfect. He carried it past the threshold and set it among the porcelain that had crossed oceans to sit on a table that had been built with hands like his. The guests leaned forward, bright and hungry. Reverend Collings lifted his glass and called down, a blessing that addressed the magnolias by name and forgot to mention the bodies that had made the yard so level. Nathaniel laughed the laugh of a man whose shoes do not slip in mud. Clarabelle took her place, an ornament brought to life. The fiddler's bow hovered, candles caught one after another, small suns finally allowed to burn. Elias eased himself back into the kitchen's mouth, the threshold that had always felt like the edge of a well. The nightshade jar lay heavy in his pocket. The rat-bane cone was almost empty, the newspaper folded and useless now that the promise had been swallowed. He leaned for a breath on the door jamb and felt the splinters kiss his palm and plant themselves there like oaths. He could not taste the air, but he could hear it, and what he heard was the slow hinge creak of a moment swinging into place. From outside, the first toast rose, as sweet and simple as new syrup, to the bride and groom. Glass kissed glass. The sound was clean, like ice. It traveled under the eaves and down into the kitchen and across the floor and into Elias, where it broke into smaller shards that sank and settled. He closed his eyes, just once, and saw his mother's open mouth. He opened them again and stepped forward because stepping forward was all that was left. He ladled the stew for the first set of plates and carried the wine to the rims of important goblets and watched the liquid round itself obediently before letting go. He moved when told, stopped when told, breathed only when the air forgot to forbid it. Outside, the singing changed key and grew brighter, a little ragged, as if the song had found teeth. The kitchen, cooler by a whisper now that the sun had stooped, smelled of nutmeg and old smoke and something sharp that had no name, as if a herb had learned to speak plainly. The decanters sweated gently, the tureens fumed. The laughter outside reached for a higher rung, and for a second missed. No one noticed. Not yet. The river rolled where it always had, shouldering past Natchez under the hill toward Baton Rouge, and places where men made laws with their mouths. St. Catherine Creek pressed along its muddy bed, old as any story. The Natchez trace held its breath the way roads do when they remember what has been dragged along them. Elias stood at the edge of the door with empty hands and felt them tremble, but the tremor did not belong to fear. It belonged to arithmetic, to the counting up of every blow and every winter and every onion stolen, and every name spoken into a child's ear behind a smokehouse until the mouth that spoke the names was sold away. His hands trembled because the world had finally learned his measure and found him exactly the weight he had always been. He stepped out again into the light that was not light so much as heat made visible, and the song outside, unbothered by anything so small as a boy, tried to turn the moment into a dance. The moment declined. The moment kept its own time. The grand hall breathed like a creature too long asleep. Heat clung to the walnut paneling. Wax bled down the sides of candles, in pale ribs. Windows flung open toward the gallery took in only more warmth than the drowned chirr of insects climbing the night. The Whitfords' portraits looked down with eyes that felt varnished rather than human, and those eyes caught flames in their black. A runner from New Orleans, red as a wound, stitched the length of the table, and on it the crystal waited like teeth. Guests came in from the yard with the magnificence of birds. Women ruffling satin that whispered even when they stood still. Men tugging at collars made liberal by brandy and pride. Waistcoats shone like slick river fish. Shoes flashed from polishing. There were planters from Jefferson County and Adams, men whose land spread like a hand laid hard over dirt. Merchants with peppered faces who talked goods even when blessing a bride. A judge from Natchez who would smile as easily at a gallows as at a newly sodded grave. The Methodist and the Baptist both, bound by supper if not by doctrine. A pair of steamboat men toasting the season, their voices saw-scratched by steam and loud telling, a dentist from Port Gibson with clean little fingers, an alderman from Vicksburg, fat as a cask, carrying heat in his creases. Everybody knew themselves, and every knowing was fastened to someone else's shame. The musicians had come in too. Luther Dugan with his fiddle tucked like a secret under his arm, a small boy with a triangle, and a guitarist from Baton Rouge, who played as if the instrument were a woman and he had been denied her twice. They took a corner by the mantel where marble chilled their backs and loosened their fingers. When the first notes rose, the hall seemed to expand and all the dark corners blinked like old cats. Elias came last, in the fold of servants who were seen only when a hand lacked something. His blue coat had dried, stiffening into a husk around his ribs and at his hip. The pocket with the jar lay flat now, innocent as a bread heel. He carried a tureen whose mouth smoked like a bog on a cold day, and his face was what Hester had told him to make it, a wall with a window too small to crawl through. Behind his eyes, however, a little coal lived and would not be doused. It warmed nothing. It only reminded him he had a center. Hester took mastery of the sideboard, arranging platters with the authority of a general setting batteries along a ridge. Quail glistened under gravy. A ham, lacquered until it reflected candlelight like water, studded with cloves that looked like flies, sat as pleasantly as a sin confessed without consequence. Jars of pickled okra showed their spines through brine. Chow-chow winked green and yellow. Cornbread steamed, throwing off good, poor smells that made the rich think of humility without having to traffic in it. There were pies, apple, and custard, and a bowl of syllabub whipped to clouds that would survive only until the first spoon entered them. To begin, Reverend Abner Collings announced, lifting a goblet as if it were a child in need of lifting out of mud. To begin, Judge Langley echoed, and you could hear the river in the rounding of his vowels. Nathaniel Whitford offered his new bride the seat at his right, and Clara Bell sank, her satin sighing. To the house, someone called. To the future. Laughter followed, polished and ready. Elias took up the Madeira decanter and tipped it at the head of the board, filling Nathaniel's goblet. The wine caught the candle and pretended to be harmless. He moved on, the river of red trailing obediently into the glass of Judge Langley, into Reverend Collings's cup that had previously held tepid water and now seemed to learn a new word. Downslope, the Oporto went its own way into mouths of lesser rank. Glass chimed as stems touched stems with clean, tiny collisions that sounded to Elias like a far-off killing frost striking leaves, a sound made of the absence of heat. Mr. Whitford, Judge Langley began, cheeks buzzed with the comfort of his own importance. I have seen the Mississippi in all her moods, and I tell you that tonight, sir, you begin your passage in a fair current. His words worked the air like paddles. Reverend Collings laid a blessing atop the man's speech, thin and sweet as laudanum. The steamboat men raised their glasses like smokestacks. Ladies made the shape of a sip without swallowing, eyes lowered to show a certain softness in the long lashes that had cost so much time with pins and powder. Men actually drank. Hester's hand moved. Dishes slid to their marks. Elias's ladle poured gumbo that smelled of patience. Okra's silk, onion's sugar, shrimp's shadow. He set bowls in front of mouths that smiled at him without looking, and he looked without seeing. The fiddler found a lilting reel and set his elbow to sawing. Luther's bow wrote curves in the air. The guitarist dropped gold coins of sound onto it. The triangle chimed time with a child's eager wrist. Heat had not left the day. It had only moved indoors, clothed in candlelight and perfume. Beads of sweat stood where they had no business, not at the back of a neck under hair that had been tortured into ringlets all afternoon, not above a lip freshly dusted with rice powder, not inside the shell of a man's ear as if someone had whispered there from the swamp. A woman dabbed and smiled. A man breathed faster and explained it to his neighbor as the consequence of a fat suit and a thinner constitution. Nobody was given to an immediate conclusion in a house where conclusions were generally shipped in crates from very far away and opened with ceremony. Elias moved to and from the kitchen mouth as if the threshold had been hammered to the shape of him. He refilled goblets with the obedience of a river following its bed. Now and then Hester's elbow touches his like the butt of a pistol. When you pass a man too close and the weapon mentions its presence without speaking aloud. He heard the laughter and wished it had a choke in it. He watched Nathaniel lift his glass with a smug little clench at the corner of his mouth, something in the boyish gesture that said the man believed his hunger to be the center of the room's gravity, and if Elias's hand steadied, it was because the hand had learned to do so in storms worse than weddings. The first oddness was small, a little lace-gloved hand trembling as it reached to take a fork. The fingers were pale and fine, and in the tremor, the fork's tines tapped. The porcelain, a sound so soft it would have been forgiven in a church. The hand withdrew. "Mercy," the woman said to the man beside her. "Give me a moment. The heat is mischievous tonight." She laid the hand on her fan, and the fan wagged her forgiveness in the air. She looked pretty while she did it, which was for her always the point. The second oddness was a man's throat catching and letting go like a rope pulled and then slackened. He cleared it, laughed, became redder in the ear than the wine warranted. The third had the misfortune of being audible, a stuttering cough from the alderman from Vicksburg, who covered it with something caught pepper. He pressed his napkin to his mouth, and when he removed it, a grain or two of black hung there. He laughed again. Hester always did use a generous hand. Hester, who had not looked over, kept not looking over. On the runner, candle flame leaned, reclaimed, leaned again as if breathing too shallow. Flies, which had plagued the kitchen all afternoon, found their courage in the hall. They came to the sugar crusts like miniature clerics and tested the edges of the syllabub with holy little feet. Somewhere down the board, the dentist's clean fingers shook so violently he had to place his fork back on his plate to save his pride. He stared at them, a man being betrayed by hands that had always done his bidding. A moment later, the man from the steamboat rubbed at his forehead, then at his chest as if his breastbone itched. "God's heat," he said hoarsely. "Feels like Natchez under the hill in July." "It is July," his companion said, not helpfully. Elias moved, and with each step he could feel the decanters grow lighter, not because wine was departing them, but because something else was arriving at the table and pouring its own weight in. He kept his eyes on his tasks because the truth was already taller than he was and did not need his witness to grow. The giggling started near the bride, a whispery titter from one of her Louisville cousins. "Forgive me," the girl breathed, cheeks flaring with a hot pink that did not flatter. "I seem—" She covered her face with her fan, then peeped over it, and the peep trembled. She giggled again, a little higher. "Hush, Delia," hushed her mother. And that might have been the end of it, except Delia's giggle did not land. It kept going and widened itself without her permission. She drew breath as if sobbing, then laughed through it until tears crept out, and the tears were wrong, thick and slow, and left a shine like snail tracks. The judge leaned aside and retched very carefully into his napkin, as if he could perform humiliation with dignity. He looked down at the napkin and found a spattering of bright red threaded through his bile, broken vessels, tiny lights in muck, and blinked at it with judicial surprise. "Pepper," he said out loud to it, instructing it to be something. It was not. He pressed the cloth more firmly to his mouth, and his hand, which had held so many sentences, shivered like a leaf that had been praised by a storm. More wine, called Reverend Collings with a bright, brittle charm. A wedding is a covenant. It should be celebrated in gallons, not in sips. His eyes, however, had begun to shine with the peculiar glaze of a man whose insides have turned to mischief. He dabbed at his temple, and his fingers came away slick. Sweat had broken across his scalp beneath his hair and was sliding uninvited down the path of his jaw and into the collar that his wife had starched so clean. He lifted his glass to cover the motion and drank. The part of him that believed in miracles waited for wine to make all things right. Wine, busy with other duties, did not. Elias's heart beat in his wrists. He poured as he had planned and did not look at what the plan was doing. He saw only small things. A woman's eyelid fluttering in time with nothing. A man's foot working under the table as if grinding out a fire. A boy at the end of the board reaching with grubby hands for the syllabub and drawing back with a howl, as a cramp took him so suddenly he thought someone had bitten him there. The music faltered and resumed. Luther's bow skittered on a false note, and the guitarist hurried to lay something beneath it to cover the stumble. The triangle rang with an eagerness that felt suddenly wicked. Outside the gallery, one of the Natchez cousins, a man sloped with drink, began to sing a river song and got only a verse into it before his throat pinched, and the verse ended not with a rhyme, but with a gag that turned to a choke. "Open the windows wider," someone said, which made other people laugh because the windows had been open so long that the night itself had grown bold enough to walk in and stand at the corners, arms folded. A breeze. There is no breeze. A fan then, boy, fan me. Boy, Mr. Silas hissed under his breath at Elias's shoulder, each letter a little pinch. Mind the head of the table. Elias turned that way, and for a fraction, the world thinned to a single sight. Nathaniel Whitford, jaw clenched, polishing his own smile between his teeth, raising his goblet to the little speech Clara Belle's father was attempting to give. The boy-man's fingers seemed to forget their business on the stem. The goblet rocked. He caught it and laughed, too loud for the joke. The laugh stayed aloft, then fell on its face. He reached to adjust his collar and touched his throat instead, and the touch turned into a press and the press into a need because the throat did not believe in air, the way it had always believed in air. He swallowed and smiled in the same motion. The swallow stuck. You could see it, a pebble in a hose. He cleared it. The clearing was ragged. Clara Belle, turning to him with a tiny bird-like concern, laid her white glove on his forearm. Nathaniel, she murmured, the name tasting of pearls. Her mouth smiled. Her eyes had already learned to be practical. It is only the heat, her mother said from an inch too far away, as mothers often are. Do not be dramatic. At the middle of the table, the alderman from Vicksburg bowed forward, as if to pray, and then threw up what had not been blessed. It splashed onto his own plate, and the sound it made belonged too much to a barn. People jerked their heads and laughed the way people laugh when a crystal dish is knocked against a chair but does not break. Then the alderman groaned, a long, unhandsome rope of sound, and heaved again, and the second spillage carried threads of pink, and the pink spattered his cuffs and looked like embroidery invented in hell. A second cough harder from the dentist. A third from the steamboat man. The Louisville cousin's giggle turned to a sob that tore its own ribbon. The Reverend's hand trembled so that his blessing might have fallen off the table if blessings were objects. Sweat now beaded on foreheads which had no right to shine. The room's smell shifted delicately, as a snake shifts while sleeping, beneath the cloves and roast pork. Something bitter unrolled. Pardon, Judge Langley said thickly, rising, and immediately sitting when his knees informed him upward was not a place he could be. He swallowed, eyes wet, cheeks gone queerly mottled. Pardon me. He removed his handkerchief and coughed into it. When he looked, the cloth showed a lace of red that had been pushed there through a sieve finer than any net in the county. He stared. He was old enough to know what blood inside the body meant and what it meant outside. He could not immediately arrange the knowledge inside him. And then, as if the house had been waiting for the cue in the music, the first convulsion took a woman at the far end. She knocked her chair over with her back. The chair struck the runner and sent goblets walking. Wine spilled in arcs, and the arcs turned to stains so quickly the eye had to look twice to believe what it had missed. The woman, Mrs. Althea Smoot, who had never been denied the last word in her parlor, went stiff as a latched gate, eyes wide, jaw working without plan. The rattle that rose out of her sounded like a gourd full of seeds being shaken by someone you did not owe money to until now. Lord, someone gasped, not a prayer, just a name spoken at a stranger entering a room. Another man's hands spasmed, and in spasming they clamped on the fork driven to his tongue so fast he didn't feel the tines pierce it. The fork wobbled there, a flag jammed into meat. He gagged around its handle, eyes shimmering with a pain that had no language, and blood lipped out around the steel, dainty as a lady's lipstick gone an inch wrong. Pants darkened where bladders forgot their contracts. A slow wheeze took up residence in half a dozen throats, then a dozen more, a harmonium of strangled reeds. Nostrils flared that had spent their lives smelling only prosperity. Fingers curled of their own accord as if they were roasting in invisible flames. A boy, a real boy, 8 at most, sat rigid, eyes white in the quicker white of his fear. He made a sound that was only wind. His mother lifted him, and he weighed more than he had an hour before, because fear and poison both have a way of reminding bodies of their gravity. Elias did not move. He moved. He set down a tureen and lifted a plate and took 2 steps back because Mr. Silas's arm had swept out like a road and would flatten anything in its travel. Silas looked at the diners with his mouth slightly parted, not in surprise but in irritation that the evening had chosen to become interesting without asking him. "What have you done?" he hissed into Hester's face, and his breath smelled of spirits and a tooth going sour. Hester did not blink. "Cooked," she said, "as requested." Silas raised his hand with the intent of turning it into a weight on her cheek. His shoulder hit a man falling. He shoved him away, and the man folded sideways with a hollow sound, as if a cupboard had been opened suddenly, and all the bowls in it had had enough. Clarabelle rose, pretty still in terror, and then sat so fast the chair protested with a crack. She put both hands to her neck, and the gloves marked white on white. "Nathaniel," she whispered again, and now finally the pretty dropped. Nathaniel's face had gone the color of something under wax. Veins stood along his temples like roads on a bad map. His hands clawed at the air in front of his throat as if he might catch breath with them and drag it inside. He made a sound that was not a word and pushed his chair back with such force it broke an old gouge in the floor and remembered an older one. The Reverend tried to pray, "Father," but the word came out as "farther," which was wrong, and then he made a gulping swallow that did not go anywhere good. He coughed, and the cough was a red flower blooming in the cup of his hand. The dentist slid from his chair like cream. The alderman tried to stand again and vomited, hard and long, the syllabub returning as a sour cloud threading red. He fell to his knees and his knees banged, and his wife backed away and put a hand to her mouth and then wrenched it away because she could feel something crawling in her own throat. A sudden army of ants marching toward a place they had not been invited. Laughter hung for a single torn second in the middle of the hall as a man who had not understood yet told a joke to a guest who had fallen asleep with his eyes open. It broke. The triangle boy rang his triangle once, hard, because it was the only thing he understood to do when a room asked for sound. Silence followed it like a beast. Screams began properly. Not the pretty shrieks of women meant to be admired, but the working screams of bodies in mutiny. The great hall contracted around them, walls inching in as if the house were trying to contain what it had birthed. A lady crawled because her legs had decided that bending was simpler than standing. Her ring snagged the runner, and the runner bunched and plates slid, and one of the crystal goblets fell to the floor and made the kind of sound that makes children cry because it sounds like a mother shouting. "Air!" someone hollered. "Fetch air!" A window slammed against its latches and then slammed open, and the night stared in, unimpressed. The humid dark pressed itself against the sill and refused to be made into salvation. "A doctor. Where's Dr. Melton?" "Port Gibson," someone answered idiotically, because the place had always been their answer. "Water." "No water," Hester barked before she knew why she'd barked it, and then she did know. Water could carry what needed not to be carried. On the floor, Mrs. Althea Smoot's feet beat the wood in a wild, arrhythmic tattoo. The music picked it up and for a breath became something savage, then stopped altogether as Luther Dugan lowered his bow and stared at his own hands as if they had slipped from being his. The little boy with the triangle looked at the triangle and then at his mother, who was on her side making the noise that had always preceded milk when he was a baby, and the triangle fell from his hand and rang one last fretful note, and then leaned in a corner like a scolded child. Elias's breath came shallow and slow. To breathe deep was to call attention to the act. He moved to the sideboard with dishes that wanted to be moved. He cleared nothing, and yet he cleared. Hester reached to steady a platter, and her hand stayed steady. Her face was slack with the particular slackness of a woman who has seen the worst fact often enough to recognize it, no matter what dress it wears. Silas's mouth worked as he tried to invent a culprit big enough to hide behind. His eyes skipped from pot to decanter to the boys to Hester to the jars of pickles to God and found none of them appropriate to blame in public. He bellowed, "Who poured?" And a dozen hands pointed everywhere at once because guilt swims in schools. At the head of the table, Nathaniel Whitford's legs rocked under him as if someone were testing a beam. He knocked his goblet over and the stain ran like a map toward his new wife. Clara Bell flinched and then scolded her own flinch, because flinching at wine is worse than flinching at a boy. She reached again for Nathaniel's arm, and he slapped her without meaning to as his hands fluttered like fish lifted into air. The mark bloomed pale and then bright on her cheek. Her mouth went round, not with outrage but with fear that had finally learned its own name. A man clawed at his collar and tore off his stock, the linen popping like a seam from a dead man's coat. He scrabbled his nails across his chest as if the bones beneath were coming forward to greet him. Another sat very still and then leaned sideways with perfect grace and slid under the table like a gentleman taking his leave. And when they pulled him back, his eyes had made up their mind not to come along. Blood-flecked foam gathered at corners of mouths with a daintiness that mocked it. Tiny pink lace trimming on a dress that had never been clean. Vomit shone on wood, like varnish applied with a filthy brush. A woman's hat slid off and rolled, and the yellow feather quivered and lay down as if it had died too. Somewhere a dog began to bark, one of the kitchen yard curs gone brave or mad, and its bark came into the hall and looked around and decided it had chosen the wrong house. Lanterns, cold clothes, smelling salts, a hailstorm of clever nothings. The alderman clawed the tablecloth and dragged the plates upon himself. They clattered, chimed, broke, and not all of them broke because the rich have a way of surviving even the floor. Judge Langley said, "R." He could not find the rest of the word. Arsenic had sworn never to be said out loud here, and it held to its oath. He coughed and red spattered his lips in discreet dots as if some careful hand had painted them on. When the first body stopped moving altogether, it was not noticed, because the second was loudly in motion, and then the third drew attention by knocking over the chair of the fourth, and the fifth asked loudly for her mother who had been dead for 11 years. And the sixth began to sing a hymn in a voice so high and small, it seemed the hymn itself had climbed a thin ladder to get out. By sevens you lose count, by tens the mind makes a lid. By the time the number had crept to 31, the count itself had become irrelevant because the room's arithmetic had already been solved. Elias stood on the edge of it with his empty tray, eyes flat, that coal of heat behind them, a pinprick, star now, colder for being real. He watched not the dying but the failing, the rents in certainty, the small collapses of rules. He saw Mr. Silas's hand hovering and not finding a face to strike that would restore the order he carried under, his skin like a second skeleton. He saw Hester's gaze turn toward the door where the night lay like an animal. He heard the river in the silence between screams, the big brown body of it rolling on without apology, as it always had, indifferent to tables and vows and what men said on either. He held very still while chaos threshed. That stillness was not innocence. It was a decision hammered in him by many men and a few women and the land. He stared once at Nathaniel Whitford with a slow attention, as a boy might stare at a steamboat passing and understand it can sink. Nathaniel's lips were bluing, pretty as bruised fruit. His tongue bulged like a pink fish interrogating a hook. He would fall soon. He did not yet. Help them, Clara Bell had begun to plead with anyone who possessed hands. Please, please. She looked at Elias, and in that glance there was nothing of class or name, only the ancient recognition human faces have when the blood has begun to think for itself. Elias took a breath, small, rationed, unwilling to become a notice, and did not move toward her. He turned instead to the sideboard and picked up a clean cloth and wrung it out at the pump, because hands that are busy are hands that do not testify. The hall was a machine now, grinding. Somewhere a candle fell and wax spread white over mahogany, like frost. The triangle boy sobbed. Luther set his fiddle down with a care that would have insulted it in calmer hours, and put his hands on his knees as if surrendering to a sheriff. Mr. Silas reached for Elias then, at last, because something in him had decided that a boy was the size of the guilty he could manage. but Hester stepped between them with her broad back. "Not mine," she said, a sentence so simple and straight it seemed carved. Silas's mouth snapped shut on the easiest future. Elias slid sideways like a chessman who has known all along its diagonal is its truth. He kept his face a wall. Inside the wall, where mortar had been mixed with salt and old fear, something else was rising. A tide at night, noiseless, lapping upstairs no one had seen in daylight. He did not look back at the table. He did not look forward either, because forward implies latitude. He went where the hall dictated in a stream of bodies, some standing, some crawling, some slack. The house creaked around the weight of its own choices, and in the heat, in the candles' thin guttering, in the music's silence, the wedding feast learned its lesson. That a room is not a church, that vows do not waterproof the soul, that the mouth which receives grace can also receive a darker sacrament and carry it quicker to the heart than any sermon. Outside, the night pressed its cheek to the window panes and listened to the way humans sounded when certainty deserted them. The magnolias worked their sick sweet on the air without lifting a finger. St. Catherine Creek kept whispering an old soft history nobody inside had ever wanted to hear. The Natchez Trace lay black between trees that had seen men die standing, and men die kneeling and understood both postures. The Mississippi rolled toward Baton Rouge as if nothing on land were broad enough to interest it. Inside, the laughter gave up the room and left it to screaming. The goblets, emptied, held nothing more dangerous than their own reflections, and the boy who had poured one river into another became, at last, only a shadow moving from one doorway to the next, while the grand hall shook itself like a rattler, and shook again and then began to fall quiet in places, which was worse than the noise because quiet meant the room had started to count. The hall had become a charnel house dressed in velvet. Every plank of wood, every strip of fabric, every glass that once glittered now carried the echo of bodies breaking themselves in revolt. What had begun as a murmur of discomfort roared into a choir of ruin. The air turned dense with vomit, sweat, and iron. 31 souls, planters, merchants, judges, and their jeweled wives, even children in lace collars, fell into the hands of something they could not bargain with. And though Elias had imagined revenge in shadow and silence, even he could not have pictured the grotesque theater unfolding now before his eyes. Men clawed their throats raw, nails dragging furrows down skin until strips lifted like old wallpaper. Blood filmed their fingers mixing with wine. Some tore open their cravats only to discover air no longer wanted them. A woman in violet satin convulsed so violently her pearls snapped, scattering across the floor like tiny bones. Each bead rolled between the feet of men now kicking blindly as their bodies jerked like marionettes cut from their strings. The sound was worse than sight. Gagging, choking, chairs splintering, the thump of skulls hitting wood, prayers strangled into nonsense syllables. One man shrieked until his voice split into two pitches like a saw played across rotten timber. Another laughed uncontrollably high and shrill, even as bile bubbled from his lips. Nathaniel Whitford collapsed forward onto the table, knocking over a crystal goblet. His groom's coat, so meticulously brushed, darkened with vomit, streaked, pink and black. His eyes bulged, whites veined with red, tongue lolling as though mocking the vows he had sworn minutes before. Clarabelle caught him instinctively, bridal silk staining with her husband's last meal. She screamed his name, again, 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 as though repetition could summon mercy. When Nathaniel seized in her arms, his jaw snapping shut hard enough to bite his own tongue nearly through, the spray of blood freckled her cheek. Her scream became something unearthly. It cut the music, cut the laughter, cut the very air. Then her own throat betrayed her. Her chest heaved, spasms racking her, like a doll shaken in cruel hands. The pearl pins in her hair tore loose as her head whipped back, and her eyes rolled white to the ceiling beams. Still, she clutched Nathaniel's twitching body, the grotesque parody of wedding embrace. The 31 deaths unspooled as if time itself had shattered. At one end of the table, Judge Langley pitched sideways, striking the floor with the dignity of a toppled monument. Blood trickled from his nose in a single stubborn line, pooling in the crease of his mustache before dripping to the rug. Near him, Reverend Collings clawed at invisible insects, hands tearing his own face open until rivulets of red traced the wrinkles earned by decades of hollow sermons. His final gasp resembled not prayer but laughter, a gurgle lost under the greater din. Children shrieked and writhed, their small bodies folding unnaturally, limbs bending as though joints had multiplied. A little girl in ribbons kicked so frantically, her patent leather shoes flew off, one landing on the table, the other in the stew. Her mother collapsed beside her, froth spilling in tandem from both mouths. The smell of death bloomed fast, stomach acid, loosened bowels, ruptured vessels, and even those still staggering upright were forced to breathe it, choking before their own poison finished its work. Silver forks clattered to the floor, plates shattered, food mashed under flailing limbs. Once pristine gowns tore at the seams, satin soaked through with sweat and blood. The grand Whitford hall, meant to echo with blessing, became a slaughter pen. Mr. Silas Breedlove, overseer of men and punisher of children, bellowed commands that dissolved into panic. He struck one convulsing man in the chest as though brute force might chase poison out of the blood. The man only spasmed harder, eyes rolling back until only whites showed. Silas cursed and swung again, but this time he slipped on bile and dropped to one knee, his rage suddenly ridiculous against the scale of the dying. Hester May, the cook, stood with arms folded. Her face betrayed neither triumph nor fear. She simply watched, lips pressed so tightly they nearly disappeared. She knew better than anyone that kitchens are both womb and tomb, depending on the recipe chosen. Elias glanced at her once, quick as a boy daring to look at the sun. Her eyes did not return his, but something in her posture said she already understood what had been done. A planter's wife, cheeks gaunt from years of parasitic refinement, bent double until her forehead cracked the edge of the table. The sound of bone against wood silenced those nearest her. She slumped sideways, her hand still clutching a napkin as though politeness were armor against death. The violin slipped from Luther Dugan's hand. It fell silently, cushioned by bodies writhing on the floor. His bow arm trembled uselessly. He crossed himself once, twice, muttering words not meant for polite ears. Then he fled the hall, abandoning music to the groans. The triangle boy wailed, his small cry swallowed in the storm. The feast had turned on itself. Food, meant to glorify wealth, now lay corrupted. Stew smeared across the floorboards, pies overturned into sickly puddles, crystal goblets shattering, under heels kicking their last. Every object bore witness, every surface stained with testimony that no sermon could cleanse. Elias stood within the whirlwind yet untouched. His hands no longer trembled. He carried empty plates, set down clothes, fetched nothing. He moved through the chaos like a shadow without form. His eyes burned not with joy but with a terrible stillness, knowing that this was not salvation, only inversion. The cruelty of the Whitfords had curdled into a grotesque spectacle. Nathaniel's spasms slowed. He convulsed once more, vomit running from the corner of his mouth, then sagged against Clara Bell, heavy as a stone dragged from a riverbed. She shrieked until her voice broke into ragged rasp. Her body heaved once, twice, then her throat betrayed her too. The bride and groom, bound by rings and death, collapsed together in a heap of satin, lace, and fluids best forgotten. Around them the 31 made their own exits, each more horrible than the last. A merchant tore at his own chest, nails, raking until flesh opened, as though he could carve the poison free. A young boy's body bowed like a bowstring, his back arching until the tendons snapped and silence followed. An old planter thrashed so violently he shattered a chair, wood splinters lodging in his cheeks. A woman gagged until her eyes burst tiny vessels, face spotted red like a plague mask, and still they fell one by one, until the hall was carpeted in the rich and powerful, stripped of all dignity. For Elias, time itself slowed. He heard every gasp, every gurgle, every last plea for water or mercy. He smelled the sour mix of wine, blood, and stomach acid. He saw the sweat dripping from the crystal chandelier above, its light flickering across faces turning purple with asphyxiation. The massacre completed itself in minutes, though to those inside it eternity seemed to stretch across every convulsion. 31 lives extinguished beneath the candelabras of the Whitford house. 31 bodies that had once laughed, ordered, punished, and stolen, now reduced to grotesque shapes, on the floorboards. And the silence that followed was not silence at all. It was the hiss of breath too shallow, the occasional moan from one not yet gone, the buzz of flies already crawling toward their inheritance. Elias stood among them, tray pressed flat to his chest. He felt not triumph, nor relief, only inevitability. This was what the land had been whispering since his mother's blood soaked into its furrows. This was what every whip crack, every hunger pang, every auction cry had been summoning. He looked once more at Nathaniel and Clara Bell, bodies entwined, their wedding finery ruined beyond recognition. The tableau was obscene, holy, and final. The horror only deepens from here. Subscribe and comment if you're brave enough to read the rest. The candles guttered. The hall stank of death. And in that suffocating ruin, Elias Carter, enslaved, boy of the Whitford plantation, knew the world would never be the same. The Whitford place did not fall quiet so much as change the key of its noise. Screams thinned to hoarse moans. Chairs stopped breaking because there were no chairs left to break. The chandelier quit glittering, its prisms coated with a fine mist of breath and spatter, and gave back only a dull, watery light. Then doors flew wide and people stumbled for air as if the night outside had been folded up for them like a mercy. They came off the gallery in handfuls, clutching at the rail and each other, silk dragging across the boards with a sound like skin across dry bark. Men lurched to the steps and did not find them, pitching into the sugar sand headfirst, coughing red strings that traced their chins like threads from an unraveled seam. Women bent double and retched until their corset popped like musket fire. Somebody shouted for water, and the first bucket carried up from St. Catherine Creek sloshed a dark, greenish smell over the landing, and the woman who drank from it vomited harder, a long brown rope of what had been river and wine and stew. Beyond the gallery, the magnolias wore the night like jewelry, and the frogs made their idiot prayers, and crickets chirred on, not having learned the word wedding. A wind rose and sat back down. Clay held heat a little while longer and then let it go, and the letting go carried the smell of the hall into the yard, iron and bile, and a sweetness pretended by dying. Elias slipped through the doorway last, behind Hester and the kitchen girls and the triangle boy who had forgotten his triangle. He carried nothing in his hands and kept his elbows tucked in tight, less a person than a seam in the air. On the packed ground beside the steps, Judge Langley had made it as far as the jasmine trellis before he dropped to his knees, working at his throat with delicate fingers as if losing a knot in a child's ribbon. He whispered Fowler's without the apostrophe and gathered the dirt in his fist like evidence. Then his hand opened and the dirt fell. That was the last thing he did neatly. Jesus, breathed Luther Dugan the fiddler, standing with his hat off, not from respect, but because the heat would not let him wear it. Jesus, Mary. He crossed himself backward by accident and did not fix it. On the lawn, a boy tripped on a woman who had never learned the names of the people who cooked for her. He went down with a howl and rolled in what she had left. He tried to wipe it from his cheek with both hands and made it worse. Hush, his mother commanded from a distance that had grown larger than the yard. The enslaved were scattered first by instinct, and then by calculation. A movement like birds startled out of a tree only to discover nothing in the air had changed. Some ran for the quarters beyond the crib barn, feet slapping the hard earth, breath puffing like a chased animal's. Some crouched behind rain barrels and ox yokes, as if the day itself were an overseer to be hidden from. Some stood still the way rabbits do when a hawk's shadow crosses, head down, ears flattened by the idea of silence. A few, braver or more foolish, drifted toward the fence and found the road's dark mouth where the Natchez trace lay, black and older than promises. Back! Silas Breedlove's voice cracked over the yard like a green cane. He had found his footing and his rage both. Back to your places. I'll hang the first one of you I catch in the road. He held a pistol because a pistol is a sentence you can carry in your hand. He fired once into the air to teach the sky what noise meant. The crack ran across the fields and turned the far cotton rows briefly into ears. Hester didn't flinch. You don't own the air, she told him. And that simple thought made 3 people within earshot forget to be afraid for a breath. The kitchen girls pulled their aprons over their heads as if to hide inside their own work. One of them, Purdy, sobbed, a small careful sound like someone learning to play bones. The other stood with her hands bunched at her sides and looked at the big house as if it were a mouth that had tried to spit and choked. Elias watched it all as if he were standing deep in the creek, where the water made every sound different. His hands had curled themselves without asking, nails half-mooning his palms, and when he uncurled them he saw tiny white crescents in the dirt of his skin. He did not look at his pockets. He did not look at the door behind him where the hall still labored like an animal trying to give birth to a thing already dead. He looked instead at the slope down to the trees. For a long, bright moment his legs thought about it, the long run under the cypress knees, a quiet place under the blown-down sycamore root where a boy could breathe creek and grow moss. Then the moment folded. "Elias!" Silas bellowed. It had taken him almost no time at all to shrink the universe into something he could strike. "Boy, here." Hester moved and conspired to be between them. "He's fetching clothes," she said, and handed Elias an empty pail. It was a ridiculous shield. Silas stepped to the side and looked at him square, his eyes shiny as though a thin film of water had been poured over them. "Fetch them after," he said softly. "Now you come." Men still living lay on the lawn like felled saplings, heaving in uneven wind. A woman crawled toward the steps, dragging the broken hem of her dress like a snared fox drags the trap. The triangle boy made a noise and sat down on the grass very carefully, as if afraid to disturb the way it had decided to be. Luther put his hat back on wrong and began to walk toward the gate without deciding to. The yard's center was vacuum. Elias stepped into it, the way a child steps onto the scraped floor where a rug used to be. Mr. Silas took his arm, not the way a man takes a tool, but the way a fisherman takes a rope that has burned his hand before. Elias did not fight because fighting makes a shape that is easy to shoot. He let the hand have him. Hester's eyes went flat as old iron. "He ain't the only one you want, breedlove," she said. "If you must have a neck." Silas's mouth made a smile that lived nowhere else on his face. "I will have all of them," he said, and they were all larger than his teeth. They crossed the yard, stepping over a merchant murmuring that his mother was coming down the stairs with a pie. The merchant had never known stairs with pies except in stories. They stepped around a woman who had managed to die prettily, neck at an angle a painter might have liked. Elias kept his eyes on the dust caught in the lantern light. The dust glittered as if wealth had been ground up and thrown over everything. By the hitching rail, 2 of the share overseers, men hired from outside the county for their willingness to find the line between cruelty and calculation, had gathered 3 field hands in a huddle, rope around their wrists. One field hand said, "I was in the crib barn all night." The overseer holding the rope said, "Then you didn't see what you did and yanked." The man stumbled forward and did not argue with the logic because arguing is one of the ways you get named. At the whipping post, tall wood with a personality, the straps hung loose, bored after a long day with nothing to hold. Mr. Silas dragged Elias against it with an efficiency that had muscle memory in it. The boy's chest struck the timber and the timber answered like a hollow man. Leather slithered across his wrists and bit down. Elias felt the bite and accepted it into the book of bites he carried inside. People were still dying. Inside the hall, a body knocked a chair again and a goblet rolled in a slow circle, singing the last note it would ever know. In the gallery, Clara Bell lay with her head in her mother's lap, eyes wide and dry now. Whether she was past the poison or only waiting for a later hour to inherit it, no one could say. Her mother stroked her hair as if smoothing a ribbon. Her fingers came away pink. She wiped them on the rail and did not look. "Confess," Silas said, which is what men who own nothing inside themselves ask of others. "What did you do?" It was not a question. Elias dropped his forehead against the post long enough to feel the grain print itself briefly into skin. He tried to understand the word confess the way a snake understands a fiddle tune. The word had always meant different things depending on who was listening. "I served," he said, And it was true. Silas drew back his fist and then, remembering the pistol, set the fist down at his side like a tool that no longer suited him. A lantern in the yard blew out in a cough of smoke and men cursed. Another caught, and the new light made everyone's faces strange as if they'd been carved from different kinds of wood. The triangle boy had decided the triangle was a part of him after all, and was hugging it to his chest. When the metal edge touched skin, it left a clean line on his sweat. "Leave the boy," Hester said. She had fetched a pail and a cloth and soaked it and wrung it out without attending to whom it might cool. "You have no stomach for what you think you are about to do." Silas turned his head, slow as a hound sniffing a lie. He looked at the bodies in the yard, at the smear of the hall's light across the grass, at his own boots, at Hester, at Elias bound to the post. His jaw worked like a hinge with grit in it. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow when we count the dead, we will start with him." He took a step back to admire the promise. Then he doubled forward and vomited into the dust, hands on his knees, the back of his neck glossy with sweat. The overseers glanced away out of a professional courtesy, and then glanced back to see if he needed help, and decided he did not. "What, now?" one asked, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, leaving a dark comet-tailed smear across his knuckles. "Tell Mr. Whitford," said the other, and then bit the words in two when he remembered the shape Mr. Whitford had taken. Nobody knew whether the old man was alive. He had been carried to his chamber by men who did not plan on carrying, and now those men were lying on the floor of that same room, remembering the faraway noises their mothers used to make. Someone brought out salt and scattered it across the threshold for no reason that would hold water. Someone else ran for Dr. Melton and came back with the news that Dr. Melton's cart was wedged in the ruts between here and the Port Gibson Road, and the mule had made up its mind. A prayer was attempted and then stuffed away in a pocket when it came out wrong. From the quarters rose a different language of sound, low, crowded, bent against the wind. Mothers counting children by name, men saying their names aloud quietly so no one else could say them first and own them. A couple of younger boys jostling, because jostling is what panic looks like when it refuses to be called by its name. An old woman sang 3 notes that made a fence around her, and anyone who got inside the fence felt better, and anyone who stayed outside envied them for their trespass. Elias listened because listening had always been his first tool. He heard the creek talking about yesterday. He heard the cotton rows hum the sleep of plants that do not dream. He heard the breath of the post against his cheek, a dry, sapless ghost of pine. He heard his own heart knock once, twice. A locksmith found at last to open a door that led to a tiny room where nothing lived except the shape of his mother's mouth when it had been all breath and then none. "Bind him tighter," said one overseer without looking. The other did, tugging the strap until Elias's fingers went numb. The strap's buckle muttered as it settled, small talk between iron and leather about how work is done. Hester brought the cloth to Elias's neck and held it there. The cool was so thin it might have been imagined. She did not look him in the eye, for his sake or hers or the sake of tomorrow. "Breathe through your nose," she said to nobody. "Breathe as if you lived through worse, because you have." Then she set the cloth on the rail where night air could find it, and walked back toward the door, picking her way around the fallen as if they were sleeping men who might claw her ankle in play. A little rush toward the gate flared and failed, as the share overseers put their bodies in the opening and stared down the field hands who had reached it. Those men let their shoulders slope again and tried to make themselves into versions of their fathers that would not be missed. One of them, Amos, who had a slow, kind voice when the world allowed it, lifted his hand slightly, palms empty, and said, "We didn't do this." The overseer answered with silence, which is the way men say "I know" when they are paid to. "Say something else." Inside the big house, a clock ticked too loud, some parlor piece that had decided it was a courthouse. From the kitchen yard came the click of a bucket handle, and the soft drum of water in a pail, and the scrape of a ladle. The triangle boy hiccuped twice and then fell asleep upright, his mouth a small surprised O. Luther had vanished. The river went on muscular and blind. "Lock him," Silas said at last, wiping his lips with the back of his wrist and leaving a second stain to argue with the first. I ain't wasting good leather on showing anything to the night. Lock him and we'll see where morning stands. He pronounced morning like a man named a witness, eager and with the hope that the witness owes him. They unbuckled the straps, 1, 2, and grabbed Elias hard by the elbows as if he might try to fly. His arms prickled with blood pricking back to life. They marched him across the yard to the smokehouse because all punishments eventually choose the same rooms. The door's wood had swelled with the day. The hinges complained. Inside it was black pepper and ash, old lard and the faint song of meat that had long ago become bones. Hooks hung from the rafters, listing in a non-existent breeze. Someone had left an axe in the corner, blade turned down, which is a kind of prayer. The lock clicked, a small sound swallowed by bigger ones, and the bar laid across the door made a heavier, more satisfied noise, like a man sitting in his favorite chair. The share overseer outside jiggled at once as if to be sure the night would not talk him into changing his mind. Boots shuffled. The yard moved on to its next task, which was not moving at all. Inside the dark was immediate and thick. It found Elias's tongue and settled on it, tasted of salt and old smoke. He stood without touching a wall, because touching things in the dark teaches them where you are. He counted lily pad breaths, the kind that float and do not sink, and when a rat skittered over his foot he did not bother with fear. His fear had other business. His ears found the hinge of the world, a drip somewhere slow, a squeak where a hook turned in its ring, the distant rattle of harness because somebody had finally thought of the mule again. He thought of running and let the thought burn out. He thought of confessing and let that go too, because confession here would be the kind that fixes nothing. He thought of his grandmother whispering names of plants, and the memory came as clear as a lit match in a barn. He thought of his mother's mouth. He thought Nathaniel's tongue caught moving wrongly around its own root, and Clara Bell's white glove went red where it had tried to pray. Outside, the survivors' voices receded into a low, stunned murmur, the sound a field makes after a fire, when the ash still thinks it is grass. Somewhere a woman laughed and then clapped her hands over her mouth because she had not meant to. Somewhere a man said arsenic quietly, as if the word itself might bloom under his tongue and kill him. Somewhere, near the quarters, a child asked if the stars had fallen. His father told him no, that was only the big house. The night grew heavier. The sky thinned from coal to slate and then to something the color of old tin. Owls changed shifts with sparrows. The frogs gave up. The last candles in the hall sighed out and left the surfaces to their stains. A mist rose off St. Catherine Creek and came up the slope with its cool, wet hands extended, touching fences, touching the gallery steps, touching the yard where footprints had been ground into stories. Elias sat down at last with his back to the wall. The rough boards rasped through his shirt and wrote a brief sentence in his skin no one would read. He folded his legs and wedged his toes under his thighs and rested his arms on his knees, the way boys do when the day is too long and the next day is the same shape. He opened and closed his right hand until the feeling returned to his fingers, and then stopped moving because movement is a kind of appetite and he had none. He slept lightly and badly and not at all. Dreams rose and fell against him like minnows. In one of them he stood in a kitchen that was clean and not hot, and Hester sang a song with no words and his mother's back was to him. And when she turned, her mouth was not a mouth but a lamp that had gone out. In another, the river curled upstairs and lay down lengthwise on the runner and looked at him with yellow eyes and said boy without moving its body. Before dawn, the first flies woke. They found the hall and performed their old ministry small and competent. Roosters announced from 3 farms at once and were surprised to find themselves in harmony. A man in the yard groaned a long private groan and then made no sound again. The new day presented itself with the cool of a rag wrung out over a fevered brow. It had nothing to say about what the old day had done. Elias breathed in what was left of the night and out what was coming. His revenge lay behind him like a field after harvest, furrowed, black, and absolute, with picked stems sticking up like nails. Fear sat opposite him with its knees drawn up, polite as a stranger on a church bench. Between them, inevitability lay down and made itself comfortable. Boots approached on damp dirt. The bar lifted with the groan of wood that knows its job too well. Morning came into the smokehouse in a thin, pale blade. The door swung wider, and Elias narrowed his eyes against a brightness that did not yet deserve the name. "Up," said the share overseer in a voice that had been sandpapered overnight. "Mr. Whitford's dead, or is dying, or is both." He rubbed his temple with the heel of his hand, as if pushing a thought back into the hole it had crawled out of. "Silas says we count. We count the dead, and then we count the living, and then we count who needs counting again." Elias stood. He did not test the doorframe as he passed beneath it. He had no wish to learn whether it would stoop for him. The yard lay gray and slick. The air smelled of damp earth and the last of the candles. Up at the big house, shadows moved like slow fish in an aquarium. Men carrying shapes wrapped in cloths that had once been table linens, women wiping rails as if scrubbing would argue the fact. Dawn's light fingered everything as if the land had explained to it in the night where to touch. The Whitford place had not fallen, it had shifted. The difference is important if you have to live under it. They took him past the whipping post again, and he glanced once at its bald head, because that is what you do with instruments that remember you. Hester stood by the kitchen door with her hands in her apron pockets, and the set of her shoulders was a sentence he could not read yet. The triangle boy slept on a step with his face turned up, innocence making him handsome. In the pecan tree, a squirrel chattered at nothing. "Come on," the overseer said, not unkindly. Elias went, the dawn laying a clean sheet over everything that could not be made clean. The stench of death had settled low, like mist. It would lift later, once the sun was brave enough to bring out flies in armies. For now, the plantation was a painting done in bruised colors: slate sky, brown river, the white rib of the gallery, the green of fields that did not care. Behind them, in the smokehouse, the hook turned once in its ring and came to rest. In the big house, a clock struck a number that sounded wrong in a world without numbers. Out on the road, far away, somebody laughed at something unconnected to this place, and then checked himself, as if he had felt a hand placed lightly on his shoulder. The day would go on. It always did, and with it, the counting. They put him back in the smokehouse toward evening, after the counting and the dragging and the wrapping. The door closed like a lid on a jar, and the bar came down with that satisfied household sound. Business, returning to its groove. The room's dark found him easily this time. It knew the shape of the boy and where his breath went thin. He settled to the packed dirt and tucked his feet under him again, the posture of a child at prayer or a man in a canoe waiting on current. Outside, the day's heat had let go at last, and the cool crept in on my belly and hands, cautious as a possum. The board smelled of old smoke and brine. The hooks overhead clicked once as if remembering meat. He knew what morning would give him. Rope, maybe. Iron, maybe. The other thing if someone's piety required flame. He had learned early that white men like to make choices that sound like law. They would pick a method and tell it to God, and then set about believing he had told it to them. It didn't matter. The choice would not change the fact at the center of the circle. 31 of them had gone under a single night's water, and he had been the stone. Through the wall, voices came and went like lanterns swinging, some low and stopped quick, others high and running on. News moved faster than boats. A hand of rumor dealt itself out across the county with perfect skill, up the bluffs, through Natchez proper where parlors latched their shutters and then opened them again to ask better questions, down along the river where steamboatmen told one another the tale in barrooms smelling of molasses and steam. A boy did it. A boy poured death as if it were wine. The Whitford's hall went to its knees. Numbers grew and shrank in the telling, 27, 31, 40, the bride dead, alive, dead again. The stableman from a neighboring place swore the boy had looked at him and he'd felt his insides take a step backward. A woman from town said the boy had been seen eating berries from the fence line since spring and laughing to himself. The story traveled as stories do when birthed in fear, with additional teeth. In the quarters, the enslaved fitted their mouths around it in a different way. They did not say Elias's name where walls might lean in. They carried the syllables down inside their chests and laid them in the dry places with other unrecorded
names. Women who had refused to breed, men who had run and vanished between oak and swamp, babies buried shallow because nobody was given a shovel. They sang low, under breath, 3 notes long, the way you sing to fire you cannot openly feed.
The hymn had no words and everyone knew them. Silas Breedlove walked past the smokehouse twice, boots testing the dirt as if the ground might lie to him. He had slept none. The ache of not sleep hung off him like a shirt left in rain. He had vomited twice more privately. He had called himself a man aloud 3 times, and that had helped some. He stopped at the door once and leaned his forehead against it, and the pine said nothing to him that he could use. Then he cursed and went away because curses are the only tools that do not dull on nights like this. The big house kept its own weather. Inside, though he could not see it, the parlor had become a hospital for the breathing and a chapel for the still. Sheets browned at the hems where they had been pressed into corners and wound around faces. A pair of parlor maids carried lavender water in bowls because somebody thought the dead could be shamed out of smelling like themselves. A man from town had come with a notebook and a face that wanted to appear like judgment rather than curiosity. He counted twice and got different answers both times and wrote a confident number anyway. Behind a bedroom door, Clara Bell lay with her hair loose and her eyelids bruised, looking where there was no bruise, whispering Nathaniel in a voice that had no more Nathaniel in it. Midnight shook down. The mules clacked their teeth. The river, rasped, massive as ever, the water's dark shoulder rolling past the town where gamblers counted out red chips and pretended numbers obeyed a code. The Natchez Trace lay black as a string pulled tight between trees that had watched other boys become instruments. St. Catherine Creek kept its mutter, old and low, the way it speaks to fish and roots. The plantation breathed with the carefulness of a body whose lungs have learned to lie. Elias slept and didn't. His thoughts were the kind that bump and then slide under. He tried to make a face for what he felt and discovered it changed shape each time, power and its shadow, relief with a stone inside it, a hush that was not peace, a fear that had finally stopped screaming and started taking notes. He tried to see his mother as she had been before hunger made a colony under her skin, remember the seam of a smile she used for him alone, the way she pinched his ear when he lied too easily. She came back to him half as light and half as lamplight. She did not ask him why. That was a white man's question. She stood in the band of his memory and kept watch the way women do when there is no watch to keep except at a child's edge. Sometime, in the unfriendly hour, the door bar lifted. Hester's shape filled the crack, broad shoulders turned into absence by the dark, head wrapped in a cloth that made its own small moon. She eased in and set something by his knee, a cup, cool, that tasted of creek cleaned with crushed mint, a heel of cornbread, a scrap of chicken she must have stolen from the pity plate they'd created for Clara Bell. None of it was necessary to a boy with a morning like his, and all of it was necessary. She did not touch him. "Eat if you can," she said as if speaking to the room. "Or talk to it with your eyes. Food sometimes believes eyes more than tongues," he whispered. "You know? Because naming is a kind of payment." Hester's breath went out slowly. "I know the world constructed this," she answered, "and it was more than an absolution, and less than a mercy." "Child," she added after, a beat that could have grown a plant. "There are nights when a woman learns every seasoning is just a way of arguing with hunger. This—" She did not finish. The hooks above them clicked again, just once, sounding like a tongue against a tooth. "They will want you to be the only recipe," she said finally. "You are not." He drank the water, managed the bread, the chicken he held and then let go of. Hester took it back with a nod that forgave him for living inside a body that had no more use for meat. "They are talking rope," she said quietly. "They talk to each other if the preacher can find enough scripture to make it look like kindness. If the old man opens his eyes again, he will want a spectacle. If he doesn't, the younger ones will want a spectacle for his sake." Her voice thinned, then steadied. "There is a whisper to send you downriver. Quiet as a hog," she said, and even that obscene hope had scripture in it, out of sight, out of a particular sin. But whispers are short-lived things. At dawn, men remember they were told to be men. He nodded. I know. She made a soft, contemptuous sound that wasn't for him. Knowing is the part that keeps me breathing, she said, and left, with the cup. The door bar sat back down on its idea. Toward morning, the talk grew bones. Overseers conferred with men from beyond the fence, voices checking themselves against each other until they sounded like law. Someone dragged something heavy toward the pecan tree that had given shade to idle afternoons and switched to quick punishments. The earth there was beaten into a circle by years of spectacle, a theater in dust. A hymn rose and split in the quarters, one line walking south and the other east, so that even the song seemed unsure where it should be. The sky unrolled from lead to pewter, to the thinner kind of metal that takes a polish. First birds argued the right to declare the hour, then roosters, negotiated the same and agreed by accident. The Whitford house showed itself at last, white-painted ribs with gray flanks, all its porch railings scrubbed raw during the night as if wood could be made to forget. Linen hung on lines behind the kitchen, lifted and fell, a congregation at practice. They came for him at first light. The share overseer with the sandpaper voice took the bar up with hands that had stopped shaking. He peered in as if expecting the darkness to answer. "On your feet," he said, but not unkindly. This was what he had been paid for. He did not yet know if he would be paid again. Elias stood and the world tilted and then righted. The overseer narrowed his eyes, perhaps seeing the entire boy for the first time, which is a thing that changes nothing. They did not bind his wrists. There was a kind of theater in that too, a stage generosity meant for the audience to admire. He stepped out and the morning touched his face with fingers that had been rinsed in creek water. Across the yard a crowd constellated, men drained of color and thinking not of God but of pest control, women with kerchiefs to their mouths that had been taken down so often the cloths were damp, a boy on his father's shoulders learning a high vantage from which the world would tell him whom to step on. The enslaved gathered along the edges, a soft dark seam binding the day to its cloth. Hester stood under the gallery's shadow, eyes not moving from his face. Purdy clung to her sleeve and twisted it until the seam begged to part. Silas Breedlove waited by the tree, the expression on him the one men carve when they want to seem like they were born to carry a particular weight. Beside him, two of the town men looked on as if auditing a debt. The old Mr. Whitford was nowhere, either done with breath or pretending to be while attendants decided how to lay his name out on the world's table. The rumor had finished its work. Elias saw it in the faces, this new knowledge of him. The boy poured death, and death drank. He felt no taller for it, no thinner. Power sat in him like a stone set in medicine, a thing tied to a string and lowered down the throat to weigh something that could not otherwise be weighed. The weight was his. For once, it was not theirs. They led him toward the tree because men love symmetry. He recognized the steps a body makes when it has been marked for a certain end, the way the shoulders lift to meet the neck as if hoping to hide, the way the feet keep finding the ground because that is what feet do, the way the eyes decide whether to look at faces or past them. He chose faces. He looked at Silas, whose mouth twitched once as if stung by a memory of being powerless. He looked at the alderman's widow, who stared back with an emptiness that was almost gentle. He looked at the boy on shoulders, and the boy looked away. "First, any last words?" somebody asked, too loud, as if volume might perform righteousness. The question was so worn it shone. The crowd rearranged itself to hear better. Elias rolled the words in his mouth and found that they did not want a place there. Last words are for men who have lived inside speeches. He did not offer any. The quiet that came was not his punishment. It was his thing to keep. "He should confess," said the preacher from Port Gibson, his voice still edged by last night's poison as if citric. "Confession makes a path." Hester's chest lifted. She held her breath and then let it down like a bucket into a well, slow. Elias turned his head slightly, enough to make a small, clean refusal. The preacher opened his Bible to a place he thought was helpful, and then closed it without finding what he wanted. Scripture was good at dressing grief. It often failed when asked to tailor rage. "Bind him," Silas said, voice cracking from use, and the words sounded like a man ordering a rug rolled up for travelers. The share overseer stepped forward with lengths of leather and then, oddly, stalled. He stood with the straps in his hands and looked at Elliot, the boy, and saw only a boy with wrists like sticks and a mouth still chapped from a fever he'd had 3 winters ago. He swallowed and did his work. He was not a cruel man by preference, he was a man by employment. As the first strap snugged, a murmur ran along the enslaved like wind through pine. It had no words, and all the words, "We are watching, we are counting." We are learning the shape of this requirement. The murmur was not defiance. Defiance has edges. This was the sound of a new room opening inside people, a place to put something. Inside that room, the story of the boy began to settle, not as instruction, not even as warning, but as a hush that would stretch under other nights. Those who had spied him near the garden would tell it. Those who had not would add details the way the hungry add beans to stew and call it plenty. He would become an instrument in their mouths even as he became a body in this yard. That is how terror and hope travel in the same coat. Silas lifted his hand for silence that already existed. He began to speak in the tone of a man explaining weather to a crowd, insisting that it meant what he needed it to mean. Elias watched his lips shape words like order and law and example. None of those words could find his ears. Behind Silas, over the fields, the sun came up with the indifference of a big animal. It laid gold in the cotton's furrows, flattered the Whitford roof, warmed the rope that hung ready or the wood set aside or the iron someone had oiled. Elias could feel that warmth on his cheek. He could feel, too, the grief standing around him, tall and complicated as oaks, a grief that had tar in it, and a little honey. Tar for what had always been true, honey for what had been done to it. He thought then, not of the men thrashing under candlelight or of the wedding song breaking its teeth, but of the creek's dark pockets where catfish rested like hands and dragons of mud pressed themselves against banks. He thought of his grandmother's whisper, "Don't name what you do, child. Let the land name it for you." He did not know what name the land would choose. He knew only that names belonged to those who lived to use them, and he would not. "Look, at him," someone said from the edge, one of the fieldmen in a voice carried by accident. "He looks like anybody else's child, he does." The remark was swallowed by the necessary bustle of righteousness, but it lodged in a few throats anyway. A thing to be coughed up later, alone. Whether they used rope or blade or a ring of fire would be a footnote. The true fact had already happened, and it would go on happening as long as a certain kind of hunger needed to be fed with people. Boys would be kneaded into shapes by whips and grief until their hands learned measures no book had taught them. Women would sing words under their tongues until the words salted their blood. The land would bear it with the patience of something too old to argue. Elias lifted his chin an inch, not pride, simply to make his neck a place he could still own for a breath. He found Hester's face and let his gaze light there, as on a hearth. Her mouth made a small movement that could have been a prayer or the beginning of a curse or the plainest sentence in the world, "I see you," that was enough. He let his breath out and did not drag the next one in. For a half heartbeat, the yard leaned toward him as if surprised that a boy would help time along. Silas made his motion, and the men obeyed, and the world's mechanics went to work. In the instant before it settled, whatever it was, the crowd's murmur fled, and left a silence clean enough to shave with. In that silence, Elias heard everything he had ever been given and ever had taken. The slap of a paddle under a steamboat, the click of a hook in a smokehouse ring, the discreet chandelier chime of 2 goblets kissing, his mother's breath lifting once and then deciding against it, his grandmother's plant names walking their soft feet across his skull, St. Catherine Creek talking to its own bed, the trace holding its black line for someone else's night. When the silence cracked and rushed back as sound, when the yard exhaled, when grief remembered how to perform itself and rage remembered where it keeps its boots, Elias was no longer a boy standing in a yard. He was a piece of a story the land would carry like a scar, not tender but not numb either. He was a hymn with only 3 notes and no words that anyone dared sing out loud in full daylight. He was the proof that silence, left to rot under heat. And hunger grows teeth. The county would change nothing officially. Papers would say an accident or act of God or the devil's ride through a house with too much pride. Men would ride armed on Sundays for a while, and then forget which sermon they'd learned that from. The Whitford place would plant and pick and sell. The big house would be painted again. A new chandelier would glitter where the old one had learned what breath does. But under all that, the murmur would go on. At laundries, in backlots, on the traces' edges, down by the ferry where river fog made men speak softly, the tale would be shared again. About the boy who learned the fence line's berries, who crushed night and winter's white into a paste and wrote his name on a wedding with it, who stood without last words. The numbers would wobble. The truth would not. Hester would live long enough to see the story returned to her with flourishes, and her mouth would bend once at the corner, in a motion she would refuse to translate. The triangle boy would grow, and a scar would live white, across his left shin from that night's splinter. Sometimes drunk, he would ring a spoon on a jug and the sound would climb back inside him and sit down. Silas would learn to sleep again by forgetting the shape of a small chin lifted an inch, and the forgetting would cost him pieces of himself he would misplace elsewhere. Clarabelle would marry again. Men do not leave wealth unguarded, and she would keep a bottle of Fowler's in a chest she never opened, just to know that the white dust slept inside her house, because sometimes it is worse to banish a thing than to keep it and learn its measurements. As for the land, it would remain patient as iron under paint. Cotton would burst its bowls with that soft, rude sound that always makes a picker's mouth dry. The creek would go on telling only its own stories. The trace would keep the footprints of men who were told they were men and reached to prove it. The pecan tree would bear and drop, bear and drop. Children would pry shells open with their teeth and learn early the taste of bitterness and sweetness, arguing in the same meat. A year from now, a woman boiling shirts in lie behind a different big house would bend to stir and, without lifting, her head will murmur to the woman beside her, "Did you hear of that boy on the Whitford place?" And the other would answer, "A little," meaning, "I have kept it like a hot coal in my dress." And the first would say, "They say he did. 31 all told." And the other would say, "They say he did what a country been asking the air to do for a long time." Then the pot would boil over and scald one thumb and the story would stop where it always does, in the middle of work, and nobody would notice that the steam, just then, smelled of mint. By night, the hymn would return, 3 notes, no words. Mothers would hum it into children too small to be made into tools yet. Teenagers would grind their teeth to it and not know why they woke sore in the morning. Old men would tap a boot heel to it in the doorway and pretend it was some other song. The hymn would be a small door inside a room, inside a heart that keeps opening. They loosed the straps from the post when the audience had had its fill of seeing. The men did the work they were born into and trained for, tying, lifting, carrying, hands competent as always. Elias did not make them clumsy. The sun climbed, indifferent and thorough. The river took a barge and a roomer at the same speed. The Whitford place wrung out linens and hung fresh ones, the memory of bile bleaching them slightly bluer than before. Flies drew their own maps and left them on sills and rails for anyone who cared to read. And the smokehouse, that small, hot chapel, held its smell and kept its pact with the past. Inside, the hook turned once and stopped again. A rat had the last of the cornbread Hester had brought and died of nothing except rat. Elias Carter, born on this soil and taught by it, sat down in the land's ledger where men who reckon cannot erase. He filled a line that had waited for ink. He was not the first to write there, and the space beneath his name had room for more. He had not wanted that, perhaps he had. It no longer asked him. The yard emptied by degrees. The voices thinned until they sounded like insects. Hester stood a long while under the eaves until the shade moved away from her, and insisted she step forward. She did, because stepping forward is the last service the living owe the dead. In the quarters the hum began again, low, careful, sure. The day hardened. The story softened and spread. If this story unsettled you, subscribe. And comment below. Your voice will help keep these dark histories alive.